Here is supposed to be a sacred resting place of our ancestors on the island of St. Statia.
Welcome to the podcast Reclaiming Our Stories, Restoring Our Ties. My name is Ulysses Lopes, and you are listening to the podcast series by the St. Eustatius Afrikan Burial Ground Alliance, a grassroots organization formed as a result of the protests against the excavations on the 18th century burial ground of enslaved Africans, the Golden Rock, that were started by a team of international archaeologists in June 2021 in St. Eustatius. In this podcast, you will learn about the journey of the Alliance, its vision, and the important role that the community of Statia, the Caribbean, and the great African diaspora serve in reclaiming our narrative, history, and identity, as well as restoring our ancestral dignity and spiritual ties. So today we will talk with Marjolijn, a theoretical archaeologist with a focus on philosophy and ethics. We'll explore how she joined the Afrikan Burial Ground Alliance and the significance of collaborative approaches in archaeologies. So Marjolijn, tell us, how did you join the St. Eustatius Afrikan Burial Ground Alliance?
Well, it was in 2021 during the protest saying they should stop the excavation at the airport. And at that moment, I was not very familiar with St. Eustatian archaeology, but I was interested in post-colonial issues. And I signed a petition because I thought, well, if the community is not involved, then they shouldn't be excavating. So I signed it and I left a remark like archaeologists shouldn't be doing this and it should be a broader discussion. And then Kenneth approached me like, hey, you're an archaeologist. We need more background information. Would you like to help us? And I agreed on that. And since then, I've been an active member of the Alliance.
And how did your interest in archaeology actually start? Like, how has your view and way of thinking changed over the time?
Well, most archaeologists say I've wanted to be an archaeologist all my life, but I always wanted to be a brain surgeon, but that didn't happen. So I was always interested in human culture and how humans interact, also in art history. And I just accidentally really rolled into archaeology because I was at the open day of the university. And I was like, oh, all my interests come together here. It's about human interests. It has a bit of material culture. It has some art history. And it's much broader than art history itself. So this looks like a way more interesting study. So I chose to study that. When I started, there was no discussion about colonial issues whatsoever. You could choose from whatever country you wanted to go to. If you want to go to Egypt or the Caribbean or Eastern Asia, there was never a discussion about it, but I chose the prehistory of the Netherlands and theoretical archaeology. Over the years, my interests have shifted because first I was very interested in the Dutch prehistoric archaeology, but I found it lacking in connection with the social issues that were playing at the moment. So I changed over to more contemporary archaeology and participatory archaeology, where you work with the communities.
Okay. And how has colonialism, as you said, influenced the field of archaeology, particularly in the Dutch context?
Well, the field of archaeology has its origin in colonial practice. Like one of the first Dutch archaeologists, he got interested in the colonial collection of France that they had looted from Egypt. There were a lot of archaeologists who have a colonial background because they were born in Indonesia. Doesn't mean that its focus is colonial, but there's a colonial tendency. And I did some research on a Dutch magazine. And in every magazine, there's like 4 or 5 mentions of colonial contexts. but it's never questioned. It's more like, oh, yes, I was born in Indonesia and that's where I got my interest for culture. Or, yes, we went to the Middle East and had a great excavation, but the colonial questions were never asked. So it's been part of Dutch archaeology, but it's never discussed, at least not until a few years ago. I think there's beginning to get some discussion, but it's still not a broad issue.
And as far as the remnants of colonialism, does it still persist in modern archaeological practices?
Yes, it does. I mean, St. Eustatius is one example of it. You are governed in reality by a colonial entity, which is the Dutch government. But we don't think that it's necessary that you have the same protection in laws and everything as the Dutch do in the European part. So that's a colonial issue that is still playing. People go to St. Eustatius and collect artifacts and bring them back to other institutions without really asking the local community. So these are still colonial practices. And so I could mention many more instances. So it's still a big part of how things operate.
Well, let's dive a bit more into the archaeological developments here on St. Eustatius. Could you provide us with an overview of the major projects and the impacts on the island?
Well, the major things, I mean, in the 20s, there was some archaeologist, Josselin de Jong, anthropologist, who visited the island. But I don't think that had a big impact in archaeology on the island itself. It's more like a memory some people have in their family. But then in the early 80s, the College of William and Mary from the United States did a lot of their field courses on the island. I think the impact of that is that a lot of information went to America and was not really part of the island. So the impact is, again, more outside the island than on the island. Although I think it led to also some, like Derek Simmons, one of the Alliance members, he studied also at that college. Maybe it did have influence in that sense. Then in the middle 80s, the Leiden University did a big excavation at the Golden Rock, which is where now the airport is. I think that's one of the major excavations that had a big impact. When I was a student in Leiden, even though I didn't do Caribbean archaeology, I still knew about Golden Rock. That was something that was widely published in books and was talked about. But that was mainly an indigenous site. And what was so special about it is that they found houses. And that was something that was relatively rare in the Caribbean. There are some pictures near the airport in the bar. People have some stories, but the whole collection went to the Netherlands. It is now partly returned in the recent years after the protest of the Golden Rock and all the developments concerning that. But I think it did have an impact on the people saw the potential, or the archaeologists saw the potential of St. Eustatius as a place of interest. Then there have been a lot of small excavations. But again, the information always leaves the island. And there may be little snippets of information or school visits. But when I talk to the people of Statia, they always feel left out. So it's more for the development of the archaeologists themselves than for the island up till now.
Yeah, so somewhat the same cycle been going on, whether it's about the burial ground or other matters.
Yeah.
Okay. How did the founding of the St. Eustatius Center for Archaeological Research, known as SICAR, in 2000 change the archaeological landscape on the island?
Well, I think that was for the first time that there was a sort of archaeological base on the island. But it was already designed as a field school for external universities. So when you train to be an archaeologist, you have to go to field school. It's where you learn how to excavate sites. Everybody has to do that. And SECAR developed over the years as sort of a monopoly on the island. And they've always had a very strong link with the University of Leiden because most of their archaeologists were trained there. But again, it was all for the archaeologists. It was not for the local people. There may have been more public outreach, so like they called it, but it's always within the context of telling the locals something without really involving them. For example, we don't have access to all the reports that are there, or the community doesn't have access to the material excavated. It's all very archaeologist focused and never public focused. But they became a monopoly, so that changed a lot about who decided what was going on the island when it concerned archaeology. And that led to sort of a situation where they did whatever they wanted to do without being checked by the government.
So this is where then the St. Eustatius African Burial Ground Alliance steps in to deal with such matters. As far as the Faro project, can you explain what the treaty entails and why it is relevant for St. Eustatius?
Yes, the Faro Treaty is a relatively new treaty. It's been talked about for like 15 years, but it's been rectified. That means that the government have said we really support this like a year and a half ago. But it's always been like on the horizon, like we should do this. This is the way forward with archaeology. And the basic thing about the Faro Treaty is that people have the right to their heritage, their cultural heritage, including archaeology. And this means that you shouldn't shut out communities when it comes to their heritage. And it goes further than just saying you should give them some information. They should be able to actively engage with their heritage if they want to. And that has, of course, enormous implications, because this means that people should have a say in what happens to their heritage. We also have legislation that says that only archaeologists can do excavations and only archaeologists can decide things. But then the good thing about St. Eustatius having less law is that in practice, it should be easily implemented on the island. So from a backward position, you should certainly be able to get into a forward position where the community is actively involved in their cultural heritage, including archaeology.
Yeah, so it's kind of done in a slack way where it's still leaving out a lot of the locals in those practices, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, in the Netherlands, we are struggling with very tight regulation who can do what. But on St. Eustatius, that doesn't apply. So we could take advantage of that and really show what a beauty archaeology can be if you involve the communities. I think it will be an asset for archaeology if we involve the communities.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And when it comes to the collaborative archaeology, what does this approach really entail and why is it important in places like St. Eustatius?
Yeah, collaborative archaeology sort of originated in the USA because the indigenous people also felt like they didn't have a say about their own heritage. And they have developed laws, but also practices where now it's common if you want to do something with indigenous heritage, you have to involve the community. And collaborative archaeology goes further than just giving information. It means like the community decides along with the archaeologist, and they can also bring in their own knowledge. Because often it is seen that there's only one type of knowledge, scientific knowledge, but of course the local people also have knowledge about their culture. So you sort of want to combine those two. And in collaborative archaeology, archaeologists, of course, have a certain expertise in how to do things, but they don't have all the answers. And also they don't have all the questions. So you should really, from the start of any project, work together with the community, ask what they want to know, bring in your expertise to maybe explain things people haven't thought about. Also, sharing the benefits of what you excavate together. So if there's a story, you tell the story together. And it's not the story just for the archaeologist to tell. And if there's a gain to be made by guiding tourists or anything, you also want that the benefits go to the community and not to some company from the outside. So these are all aspects that are part of collaborative archaeology.
And as far as the key guidelines archaeologists should follow, what are some of those meaningful collaborations that they should follow as far as the African descendant communities?
So you should always seek out a community. If you talk about community engagement or collaborative archaeology, it's not like, oh, you have a little project and you go and you say, who's the community? But you have to long-term engage with people. It's not like you come in, do your project and you fly out. So you have to be aware of the community and what they are and what they want. That's the first rule, I think, of collaborative archaeology. Then you have to define together what is needed in the research and what are the questions, what are the methods used, what are our ethical boundaries. And then at the end, you also have to say who benefits and in what way, and how do we preserve it for the community? How do we make sure that they have access to all the information that is gathered? How can they express it? And how do they keep control of the narrative as well? And that last thing is a thing that archaeologists find very scary, to give away the power of telling what's happening. But I think in reality, most people in communities, and it doesn't matter if it's African descendants or I work with Malaccan in the Netherlands, is that it's not a question of giving away authority, but also finding that a lot of people are very interested in what you have to say as an archaeologist, but just want to frame it differently or have their own issues with it. And you just enrich your narrative instead of that you limit your narrative, as most or a lot of archaeologists think. And it's not always an easy process, because also in communities there will be disagreement and it takes a long time and you will be discussing things and it may be sensitive and there will be all kinds of issues. But I think the end result is better for everybody involved.
Okay. And how can, as you mentioned, the collaborative approach address historical injustices and empower local communities?
Well, I think what is the most important is that they get a say again about their own heritage, so that it's no longer only outsiders who decide what's happening to their culture. And having knowledge also gives power to people. And I think that's very important, to have that power. And also, if you have power in one area, you might feel more secure to demand also things in other areas of your life. So it really helps empower communities if they feel they have something to say about their own heritage. And it can be little things, but also big things, like it could also be that they don't want research be done on their like ancestral remains or specific spaces that have like a meaning to them. So it can be very broad, but it can also be very small, just teaching or telling stories to each other, being more aware of your cultural background.
Okay, so more sensitive topics, like thinking about the grief, burial rituals, and historical injustices. How do you see then that archaeology can become a way of healing for the descendant communities?
Well, I think at the moment, due to lack of information, people have relatively little idea about how the enslaved ancestors lived or how they buried their loved ones or the people they just knew through coincidence, because an enslaved community is different from a community that is grown naturally. I mean, this is a community that was put together. They might see also the strength of the enslaved people, because even in the circumstances under which they were, for example, burying their ancestors, they still adhered to certain rituals. They still found the courage to put things in the graves, give gifts to the deceased. All these things talk about care in a system where they were supposed not to care, not to be human. In those burial rituals, you can see the humanization of the enslaved people. And I think that narrative is very important to give another side to how we think about enslaved people. That they were not just only victims, but they were culturally rich people who, in the most horrible circumstances, still try to give some dignity to their fellow enslaved people. I think that's a narrative that we hear too little of.
Yeah, for sure, especially when it's someone else putting a narrative out there, then it makes it harder for the actual locals then to share their own opinion about how it is. So that's understandable. Well, as far as looking at the future of archaeology, what are some of the directions for archaeology, especially in post-colonial contexts like St. Eustatius?
Well, I think one of the first things is that we should put the focus away, because now the focus is often on the European colonial heritage. So we should sort of balance that out and be more interested in the enslaved history as well. And not just from the European perspective, but from the enslaved perspective. That's one of the things I think are important. Furthermore, because the enslaved people didn't have the same level of access to being writing or expressing themselves, to material culture, they are not visible in the landscape. For archaeologists, it's way more difficult to see enslaved sites than, well, the colonial buildings. So you have to have way more effort. But if we are aware of that, then we should look differently at when we decide where to excavate and what to protect and what not to protect. So we have to change our way of thinking, because the deliberate erasure in the past of the identity of enslaved people shouldn't continue in the present. So, for example, there should be many more African burial sites on St. Eustatius, but they are not marked. So if there's a development somewhere in an area where we know there were plantations, and that's nearly the whole island, we should be aware that we can always find those cemeteries. And at that moment, not think like, oh, we just excavate them and rebury it there, but also think about, can we protect them? Can we protect those burial places? So that would be a big forward step, I think, but also starting to involve the communities. I think they are trying, but there's a long way to go. The community really feels that they have a say in it, that they realize the potential of their own heritage. And I think we should take a long time and some effort to get that going.
Yeah, that for sure. It definitely needs more things shared so that the community definitely can feel part of it as well, seeing that it's their heritage, especially when it comes to collaborative archaeology. What are some important questions you think archaeologists should keep in mind regarding the ownership and interpretation of cultural and historical knowledge?
Well, I think there should be way more focus on the material culture of the enslaved people. It's not as sexy as doing DNA research and those kind of things, but it will give you better insight into cultural practices. And I think the focus should be on cultural practices because they link to people. And maybe even by talking about it, there might be remnants of those cultural practices still in the habits or the customs of the local community. There may be stories that are still there. So, yeah, if you ask those kind of questions, you get a whole different narrative, I think, than when you're just doing all the things that scientifically might be very interesting, but culturally are less relevant. So I would like that focus to shift towards the cultural aspects of the enslaved people. And there's been very little research into those things, not just in St. Eustatius in general. I think. And it is now starting to become more engaging as a field in the United States. And I think on Barbados, they are realizing also that those elements are important in your heritage.
Yeah, I think we definitely, moving forward, can see a lot more happening where archaeologists share more of the information, the knowledge, also give over more power to the descendants to partake in such research. Like you said, it is part of our heritage. So I must say you gave us some good information of your field, seeing that this is something you do on a regular basis. I would like to thank you for definitely sharing the information that you presented, the ideas that you had as well. And yeah, we look forward to hearing more from you in the near future on behalf of the St. Eustatius African Burial Ground Alliance. Well, thanks again. And that was it for the wrap up of our episode. Thank you once again for joining us. My name is Ulysses Lopes, and you were listening to a podcast episode of the St. Eustatius African Burial Ground Alliance, reclaiming our stories, restoring our ties.